Wow, what a joy it is to be with you today. I'm indebted to President Rowe, Chancellor Gates, Rector Postum, the Board of Visitors, and I'm so pleased to be with Jeff Trammell. What a wonderful honor for him, and for me to be part of this with him means a lot to me. And it's also such an honor to receive this because this is a day about history. And I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about the power of history. But I'm also happy to be here because, candidly, I told my 96-year-old mother that I was coming down here to get an honorary degree, and she said to me, "So you finally got into William and Mary." As only a mother could do. But besides by making my mother happy, it's humbling and exciting to be with you because you're celebrating history. I have been so taken by the power and the impact of history. And I've been so moved by how you at William and Mary are grappling with this. I spent a lot of time today at the Bray School, learning about it, listening, understanding the sort of unbelievably important history that is part of the Bray School. And then I learned about the Lincoln, the Lemon Initiative, and went to the Hearth Memorial for the Enslaved, and learned about what you were doing in terms of understanding the Native American impact and story here. To me, it's essential to see that these actions are not seen as simple restorative justice or ancillary actions that support the main story, but rather the embrace of history, the embrace of African American history, the embrace of Native American history is central to understanding who William and Mary is. It's essential to understanding who we are as Americans. In essence, I would argue that what history reminds us is that regardless of whether your family was here for 250 years or got here 20 minutes ago, you are shaped by this story. At a time of extreme partisanship, we need to not fear our history, but we need to embrace the past, and we need to be made better by the knowledge that we have been shaped by this history. Think about it. We're now all comfortable saying our DNA has been shaped by, our ancestors, our grandparents. That DNA shapes us. But there's also another kind of DNA. It's the history. It's our shared history. And that DNA has shaped who we are to this very day. I am really struck when I think about the importance of history by words by James Baldwin, the great author, who said, "History does not refer merely or even principally to the past. We carry it with us. We are unconsciously controlled by it. History is literally present in all that we do." And I would argue that that is so right. And what I thought I'd do is take a minute and just talk quickly about why I think this history is so important, why it has such resonance for us today. I think one of the things that I'm always struck by is the challenge and the danger of forgetting. When I was a young curator at the Smithsonian, I was doing an exhibition, and I got a letter. And the letter began, "Dear left-wing historian." So I knew it wasn't a fan letter. But the letter went on in a very serious way. They say, "What happened to the Smithsonian I loved? It used to be a place that celebrated America, that told only positive stories. And now you're going to tell stories that are better left unsaid." I must admit, though, the letter threw me off because after criticizing and hoping that I got fired, the letter ended by saying, "Best wishes for your continued success." But I think what's important to me is that that letter was right. He's right because I think you can tell a great deal about a country by what it deems important enough to remember, by what monuments they build, by what graces the walls of museums, and what holidays you celebrate. But I would suggest to you, you learn even more about a nation by what it forgets, by what it wants to leave out, by what Nietzsche called creative forgetfulness. This desire to admit, to forget, is natural, but it's also instructive, because often it's the story of those on the outside, people of color, women, who are left out of the narrative. And this was really brought home to me by a project I was doing early in my career on slavery. And I was traveling around the country looking at plantations, whether it was cotton plantations in Mississippi or tobacco plantations in North Carolina. And I came upon a rice plantation in South Carolina. And I went up this road, and there were 4 cabins that housed the enslaved, built from the 1840s. And standing next to them was a man who was in his 90s then, Princey Jenkins. He had lived in one of these cabins with his enslaved grandmother. So basically, for a historian, this is the Holy Grail, to have somebody tell you these stories. And he told me about what happened in the cabin. And he went on. And then he said to me, I'm not sure what a historian does, but maybe if you're a good historian, isn't your job to help people remember not just what they want to remember, but what they need to remember? And in many ways, that has profoundly shaped my career. In fact, it's a challenge for all of us to say it is important to revel in, to dig deeply into the history we love. But it's equally important to understand that history that challenges, that reminds us that we have a lot to do. For me, history is so important because it's also the power of inspiration. There is nothing in my mind more inspirational than American history, than African American history. And in fact, during the 11 years that it took to build the National Museum of African American History and Culture, what sustained me, what made me believe, were the stories and the peoples whose lives we covered. Think about it. Who could not be inspired by people who believed in an America that didn't believe in them? Who could not be inspired by people who could dream a world anew, who could imagine in a period of slavery, could imagine freedom, could imagine fairness? How could you not be moved by people like an enslaved woman who got up every morning and fed her kids and loved her children before she went into the fields, and every night she came back determined not to let the field strip her of her hope and of her humanity? Who could not be moved candidly by the students that went to the Bray School, who despite a desire to educate them to be comfortable with enslavement, they imagined a different future? When I look at history, I am so moved that I wish that candidly I was as strong as my enslaved ancestors. Because when we view the history of enslavement, we sometimes forget that while they were bought, they were also brave. And while they were sold, they were also strong. It is their resiliency and their suffering that inspired all who worked to build on the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Ultimately, for me, when I think about the power of history and the power of memory, I realize that what history really is, it's a mirror to America. It's a reason to understand that history is so important and so vital because it's a mirror that challenges us clearly and candidly, reminds us that despite all of what we've achieved, despite all of our ideals, America is still a work in progress. It is a mirror that makes those who are invisible more visible. It is a mirror that gives voice to those who are silent. It's a mirror that says, let us live up to the founding ideals of this nation. Let us celebrate and revel, but let us also live up to those ideals. And to me, that notion of a mirror of history was really brought home by a dear friend of mine, Studs Terkel. Studs Terkel was the great oral historian who lived his life interviewing people to understand how people lived their lives. When I knew Studs, he was in his 90s. And he once said to me, he said, Lonnie, I can't imitate him because he was so funny, but he said, Lonnie, I can't see too well, I can't hear a thing, I can't stand long. So here's what I want you to do. Make sure you point me in the direction where I can do good. And maybe that's the lesson of history, that you use the past to point us in the direction where we can all do good. That means helping a nation grapple with the complexity of its past, helping a nation embrace the ambiguity, to recognize there are no simple answers to complex questions, but there is learning that comes from nuance, subtlety, and debate. History tells us that. In some ways, the amazing thing that history is, more than anything else, is it helps us define reality and still give hope. Yes, history is replete with stories of tragedy and injustice, of pain and exploitation, but it's also a story of resiliency and redemption, of high ideals, of an aspirational vision for America. History demands that we remember those who worked so hard, who died so young, who believed so hardly in a country. because we have to remember that we're standing on all their shoulders. Ultimately, when I think about what history is, it's really about our shared humanity. And let me end with one final story. I have one superstition. I never get on an airplane without shining my shoes. So I know every shoe-shine man and woman in airports around the country. One day I was flying back from San Antonio and landed in Dallas. So I went to get my shoe shine. It was an elderly African-American man. And he began to shine my shoes, and he looked up and he said, "Are you that museum guy from Washington?" I said, "Yeah." He didn't say anything else. He finishes shining my shoes, tell you how powerful museums are, right? But he shines my shoes, and I give him $8. And he basically says, "No, keep it for the museum." Now, I got to be honest, I was a shoe shine guy. So I said to him, "Look, man, take this money." And he cut me off. He said, "Don't you be so disrespectful. Don't you know that if you do your job right, this museum might help my grandchildren understand what life did to me and what I did to life?" To me, even though I never saw that man again, his words have hounded me in the best way. To realize that history could not only help this man and his family find understanding and hope, but it's equally important that his words reminded me that embracing our past as a nation, we get to see ourselves more clearly, and that history does challenge us to be better, to be more concrete in making our ideals closer. What history does more than anything else, it challenges us to live up to Lincoln's desire for a more perfect union. Embracing the complicated past helps us realize that there is nothing more powerful than a people, than a nation steeped in its history. And there's nothing more noble than honoring all of our ancestors by remembering. Thank you very much.